It's been said that everybody's got a story to tell. Well, the person we're about to meet tonight, there's no group of people in America more prepared to argue their constitutional rights.
That's how we connect to each
Yeah.
other. That's how we connect to our communities. And that's what we tried to do here
Yes.
at the cafe.
It's nice to see all of you out here tonight. And to help us in these last days of Black History Month to bring to the Hampton University, to the Scripps Howard School, and in the Scripps Howard School, the Caldwell Cafe, our acknowledgement of Black History Month. For me, this discussion that we will put an exclamation point on tonight began a few weeks ago in the class that I teach here, Jack 454, and I had my opportunity to deal with that piece of Black history that has come past me in my time. Peter and I actually are sort of bound up together in that very different ways, but as journalists, winding up with two of the greatest leaders of our generation in that final, well, let me say, these great leaders that we acknowledge and honor and praise. And I was talking with Peter today that Malcolm and Martin both assassinated at age 39. It wasn't that these leaders, great leaders, were just walking down the street and somebody said, well, let's just shoot somebody, which that happens. But if you look at that last part of their lives, the story, it sort of explains itself. I talk about Martin. Sometimes you wonder, well, why was I there? Why did that happen this way? I believe that it is a higher power that puts you there and also puts on you a great responsibility. I feel bad in a sense tonight because Dean Plummer, she knows that I've been struggling trying to do what our guest here has done tonight. He has his latest book, Witnessing Brother Malcolm X, the Master Teacher, a memoir by Peter Bailey. Peter's close to having a half dozen books. I wrote one almost 50 years ago, trying to tell the story, which was the truth that I know. And they said, oh no, you can't do this. You can't do this now. And I did not believe that in America, which is the publishing capital of the world, could say, no, you're not going to do that. But they did. The great James Baldwin told us in his book, Notes of a Native Son, one writes out of one thing and one thing only, one's own experience. I'm wrestling with that here now. And I'm so happy that Peter is here tonight because in many ways he is a trailblazer because he puts the pencil to the pad and does it. There's a Supreme Court case, United States versus Caldwell. You never hear about it in any discussion of the free press in America. I called the lawyer who represented me in that case, and I said, that was Professor Anthony Amsterdam, and I said to him, I asked him, I said, well, all of this stuff we thought this would mean, does it really mean what we thought it would mean? Was it really that important? I said, how could they not even discuss this? And he said to me, he said, Earl, I know that you think it's race, but when so many people say they don't know, they don't know. He said, it's because you didn't write a book. I said, I did write a book, and they wouldn't publish it. He said, no. He said, you've got to write a book. It is on us to tell these stories. If we fail to do that, then this history, it just becomes another story not told. And that's why we have Black History Month, because so much of what we've been through, so much of what has happened to us, with us, about us, stories not told. This Black History Month, but we also gather here, in the shadow of the celebration of the motion pictures, the Oscar celebration. And this year was set apart, probably never in history has Black artists had the opportunity to express themselves, and that venue is now. So it is a new time. I believe that the great storytellers for this generation are you that are sitting here in this audience tonight, because you understand this technology. You see a picture that we couldn't even imagine. You will revolutionize Black History Month. You will take us to places by telling these stories that we could not even imagine. And so I'm excited about that possibility, and I'm particularly excited and thrilled tonight that we have as our guest Peter Bailey. When I asked Peter to come to Hampton, he said, yes, I'd like to come. He said, but Earl, I want to come to talk to students. I said, we could arrange that. So we have. And so here he is. I very much identify with Martin Luther King Jr. There's no journalist, no one that's had the experience of this man with Malcolm X. I don't want to grab his thunder, but let me close with this. Peter tells this story. I don't think he would mind me using it tonight, but he tells the story as a young man aspiring to a career as a writer, getting his education, getting himself ready, and coming to New York City to launch his journey. Said he got an apartment in Harlem. He said on the first night, got settled, he said he wanted to go out and check out the neighborhood. And the way he tells the story, he left his apartment, was walking down the street, and he saw a large crowd gathered on a corner. And he ventured over there, the reporter, to see what's happening. And he said he heard this man speaking. He didn't know it then, but it would be Malcolm X, or as Peter always refers to him now, Brother Malcolm. what he heard that night struck so deep within him that he took the career that he thought he was coming to New York to start, put his aspirations on hold, and the next day he went and joined, as he says, Brother Malcolm. He became the publisher, the writer of the organization's newsletter. He documented so much of the journey. He was with Malcolm every day, including what would be the last day of his life. He remembers the conversation well. We talked about it earlier. He was in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem on that day when Malcolm was, Peter, just in our conversation out here, he talked about standing over and looking at just the horror, the brutality of what had been done on his leader. He said that they would not, this is right, Audubon Ballrooms are almost right across the street from a hospital, major hospital in New York. They would not a doctor, not a person, would come across that steep street to deal with what had happened. They had to actually go across the street, get one of these dollies, not a dolly, but what do they call those things? And put him on it and wheel him over to the hospital. Of course, by the time they got there, Malcolm was gone. And at the end of the story, that part of the story, Peter was one of the pallbearers that carried Malcolm's coffin to its final rest. It's not for me to tell the story. As Baldwin said, we all have these stories, and only we can tell. It's such a thrill tonight to have my friend, colleague, we go back easy 50 years, and to have him here tonight. When I get a microphone in my hand, I don't know about, I'm not too good at what they say at putting it down. So I'm gonna put it down, and I hope you'll join me in saying, please and welcome to Peter.
Thanks, Earl. And also thanks Hampton for having me down here. I am not a college graduate. I did attend the other HU for 2 years, Howard University. And if I had gone back for my 3rd year, I would have missed the most important experience of my life, because I would have been in Washington, D.C. at Howard rather than in Harlem, and having an opportunity to meet Brother Malcolm, who became the dominant influence in my life outside of my grandfather and my father. I say in my memoir, I still wonder sometimes how a dude who I grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama, how someone who grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama, ended up being in the Audubon Ballroom on February the 21st, 1965. And it basically began at Howard. There are 2 things I did there that kind of got me launched. I walked my first picket line in 1960 when the students, the brothers sat in from North Carolina A&T, sat in that Woolworths store. For the young people, Woolworths was like, I guess what would be today's equivalent of what? Whole Foods, not Whole Foods, but a Walmart. I guess Woolworths was the equivalent of Walmart today. But these brothers sat in Woolworths because black folks could not sit at the counter. You could only go there, order stuff, and then go out. So these students from North Carolina A&T, down in Greensboro, they sat in at Woolworths. And there was a brother at Howard. I was at Howard then. He organized a group of us to go and picket Woolworths in D.C. at 14th and Irving Street in order to show our support for the brothers down in Greensboro. And that was my first time walking a picket line. So that's one experience I had at Howard. A second one was having the incredible experience of being taught by Dr. Harold Lewis, who was a historian. And the first time I took a course in my life, I had a course in this first semester of my sophomore year in history. And on the first day of class, he said to us, all of your lives, you've studied the history of people of European descent. In this class, you're going to study the history of the rest of the people in the world. And that's where I was introduced to African history, African American history, some Native American history, some Chinese history, and some Japanese history in that class. And it just struck a chord with me. I had always liked history when I was in school, but of course I was only taught the regular stuff. You know, I never was taught what I call real history, the real history of the United States. So Dr. Lewis, and I would believe this, if I had not been in Dr. Lewis's class, and I took a class at that time that I could not have gotten at any white university in America. Not a single one was teaching a course like the one I learned with Dr. Lewis. And then he made me open, he opened my mind so that later when I met Brother Malcolm and Harold Cruz and John Henry Clark and Lerone Bennett and people like that, I was open to them. And I really believe I was open to what they were teaching me because of what I had learned from Dr. Lewis. I would be forever grateful to him. And unfortunately, I don't think he ever wrote a book. When Earl was talking about my writing, well, I got that kind of direction from Harold Cruz. Harold Cruz was in writing the book, his classic book, Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And myself and about 5 other young guys, he would meet with us once a week for about 2 hours and just teach us. And I think he used that at the time. You know, he would get away from the book for a while. That's where he took a break from writing Crisis. He would meet with us, and one thing he said to us, and to follow what Earl was saying about the young people here today, that every generation must document its time. So that future generations, though they will make mistakes, they will not repeat the mistakes made by their predecessors. He said basically that we were making the same mistakes. My generation was making the same mistakes made by our predecessors because they had not documented enough. And as a result, I have become a real fanatic, and people get tired of me. Because the first thing I say to you, have you got that down? You wrote that down? You got that down? You've been taping, you know, I recently had the experience of interviewing a lady in D.C. who's 101 years old. She has been living in the same house in Logan Circle in D.C. for 89 years. I mean, she is a walking history book on Washington, D.C. And I finally got her to sit down. I got an hour-and-a-half interview with her. Because I said, you got to be on tape. You cannot not be, on tape or something like that. So I believe that very strongly. And I hope you young people really accept what Dr. Caldwell said about Professor Caldwell about doing that. It's very important. And then the other people in the room, you need to document. Whatever you're doing, you need to make sure that it is documented so that and available. When I wrote my memoir, I started off by saying that, as I said earlier, I had no idea that I would, ended up being with meeting someone like Brother Malcolm. mean, it was like, it was not even remotely a part of my mentality. But on that day, I moved to Harlem in the summer of 1962 on a Friday night. And I must say, y'all, I moved to Harlem grudgingly because I had heard all these horror stories about Harlem, and I had believed them because I didn't know nothing else. I mean, I believed that you took a chance of getting shot just walking down the street because of all the things that I had heard. In fact, when I told my mother that I was moving to Harlem, she literally cried and tried to get me not to move. But the reason I finally moved in was that a friend of mine, mother, had a boyfriend who lived right in the central Harlem, living in an eight-room apartment, for which he was paying $56 a month because of rent control. And I said to myself, for $56 a month, I'll take my chances in Harlem. So I went to Harlem, went in on a Friday night. On Saturday morning, my roommate and I decided that rather than unpacking, we would walk down Lenox Avenue, which is now Malcolm X Boulevard. Of course, now with what's going on in Harlem, I don't know how long it's going to remain Malcolm X Boulevard, because the Harlem that I'm talking, y'all have heard about, no longer exists. No longer exists. And so I was walking down what was then Lenox Avenue, and we were on 142nd Street. Walked down, we got close to 116th in Lenox, and we saw a crowd gathering. And we actually, what's going on? And they said, oh, well, Malcolm X is going to speak. Now, at that time, we had heard about him, vaguely, and what we had heard was all the horror stories. He was a demon, and he hated white folks, and he believed in violence, and I mean, just on and on. We heard all the horror stories. And so we said, let's see what he has to say. So we stopped. It was June. I'll never forget. I don't know the exact data, but I do know it was June. It was very hot. And eventually there were about 3,000 people out there. And Brother Malcolm came out and spoke. And by the time he finished, 3 hours later, I was a Malcolmite. And I've been one to this day. Because I had never in my life heard anyone talk about the race issue in America with the clarity and the forcefulness and the commitment and the analysis that he did. And there were two particular things that he said that has sustained me through the years. One, he told us that this whole idea that white supremacy was just something in the former Confederate States of America was total BS. He said it is throughout the entire country with varying degrees of intensity, but it is not limited to the South. That's one thing he told us very clearly. And the second thing, now I had kind of heard that mentioned, kind of heard that. But the second thing that he talked about that day that I had never heard anyone talk about, and he started talking about attacks on the mind. I had never heard anyone talk about attacks on the mind. And he spent over an hour of that speech talking about that, and about the movies and radio and television and textbooks and all those things, and that all of these things were basically an attack on the minds of black folks. And then I began to remember growing up in Tuskegee, going to that segregated movie theater downtown. They were side by side, unlike many places that had black folks sitting in the lobby and white folks sitting downstairs. I mean, in the balcony and white folks sitting up there. In Tuskegee, they had two completely separate movie theaters, side by side. You had the black movie theater and the white movie theater, but we always saw the same movie. And those, between 6 and, let's say, 13, I was in that place almost every single Saturday from about 10 in the morning till about 3 in the afternoon, watching many times Tarzan movies, in which this white European man and his chimpanzee beat up on African warriors. And we would be sitting there cheering for Tarzan and Cheetah. This theater full of black kids, every single Saturday. To us, that was Africa. That was Africa. And when the African warriors would be among themselves because they would speak their own language. And we would laugh because to us that meant that they were ignorant and couldn't speak English. We did not know they were speaking their own language. To us that meant that they just couldn't speak English. So we laughed at them. And when I was growing up, you call somebody African, you better be ready to fight. That was fighting words. You call somebody black, and if you call them African, you better be ready to fight. And so that was Africa to me. And then Brother Malcolm began to talk about, and not just that, I mean other things. He talked about the things that were designed to make us believe that our history began, and of course, Dr. Lewis had already kind of gotten me straightened out on that, began in 1619, which by the way is 400 years ago this year, in this state, in this state. Made it that everything for us began there, and that we had just kind of passively been a part of that with nothing accomplished except making this country rich economically. So from that time on, I was at that age, I think it was 24, I was at that age where I was rejecting Christianity. I've been raised, of course, as a Christian, as a Catholic, by the way. In fact, I tell people that I was an Irish nationalist before I became a black nationalist, because I had Irish Catholic nuns from 1st grade through 8th grade, and all they taught us was Irish history. And they made us think that the British were the worst people in the entire world, not because they were enslavers of black folks, but because of what they did to Ireland. And the biggest day in the school year other than Christmas and Easter was St. Patrick's Day. All the little black kids, we wore green, and I can still do an Irish jig that they taught us to do in assemblies. So I knew Irish history, man. I knew Irish history back, but they never taught one word about black folks and black history, not one word. Like growing up in Tuskegee, of course, I had heard about Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver, and that was about it. When I got into the public high school, now at that time, we had heard about him, vaguely, and what we had heard was all the horror stories. He was a demon, and he hated white folks, and he believed in violence, and just on and on. We heard all the horror stories. And so we said, let's see what he has to say. So we stopped. It was June. I'll never forget. I don't know the exact data, but I do know it was June. It was very hot. And eventually there were about 3,000 people out there. And Brother Malcolm came out and spoke. And by the time he finished, 3 hours later, I was a Malcolmite. And I've been one to this day. Because I had never in my life heard anyone talk about the race issue in America with the clarity and the forcefulness and the commitment and the analysis that he did. And there were two particular things that he said that has sustained me through the years. One, he told us that this whole idea that white supremacy was just something in the former Confederate States of America was total BS. He said it is throughout the entire country with varying degrees of intensity, but it is not limited to the South. That's one thing he told us very clearly. And the second thing, now I had kind of heard that mentioned, kind of heard that. But the second thing that he talked about that day that I had never heard anyone talk about, and he started talking about attacks on the mind. I had never heard anyone talk about attacks on the mind. And he spent over an hour of that speech talking about that, and about the movies and radio and television and textbooks and all those things, and that all of these things were basically an attack on the minds of black folks. And then I began to remember growing up in Tuskegee, going to that segregated movie theater downtown. They were side by side, unlike many places that had black folks sitting in the lobby and white folks sitting downstairs. In the balcony and white folks sitting up there. In Tuskegee, they had two completely separate movie theaters, side by side. You had the black movie theater and the white movie theater, but we always saw the same movie. And those, between 6 and, let's say, 13, I was in that place almost every single Saturday from about 10 in the morning till about 3 in the afternoon, watching many times Tarzan movies. in which this white European man and his chimpanzee beat up on African warriors. And we would be sitting there cheering for Tarzan and Cheetah. This theater full of black kids, every single Saturday. To us, that was Africa. That was Africa. And when the African warriors would be among themselves, because they would speak their own language, and we would laugh because to us that meant that they were ignorant and couldn't speak English. We did not know they were speaking their own language. To us, that meant that they just couldn't speak English. So we laughed at them. And when I was growing up, you call somebody African, you better be ready to fight. That was fighting words. You call somebody black, and if you call them African, you better be ready to fight. And so that was Africa to me. And then Brother Malcolm began to talk about, and not just that, I mean other things. He talked about the things that were designed to make us believe that our history began, and of course, Dr. Lewis had already kind of gotten me straightened out on that, began in 1619, which by the way is 400 years ago this year, in this state, in this state. Made it that everything for us began there, and that we had just kind of passively been a part of that with nothing accomplished except making this country rich economically. So from that time on, I was at that age, I think I was 24, I was at that age where I was rejecting Christianity. I've been raised, of course, as a Christian, as a Catholic, by the way. In fact, I tell people that I was an Irish nationalist before I became a black nationalist, because I had Irish Catholic nuns from 1st grade through 8th grade, and all they taught us was Irish history. And they made us think that the British were the worst people in the entire world, not because they were enslavers of black folks, but because of what they did to Ireland. And the biggest day in the school year other than Christmas and Easter was St. Patrick's Day. All the little black kids, we wore green, and I can still do an Irish jig that they taught us to do in assemblies. So I knew Irish history, man. I knew Irish history back, but they never taught one word about black folks and black history, not one word. Like growing up in Tuskegee, of course, I had heard about Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver, and that was about it. When I got into the public high school, I learned that. I was not, and I'd gotten to the point where I was eventually baptized a Catholic, and then one day I told the priest, when the movement had started, the civil rights movement had started, and when I saw in some of the Catholic schools what was going on, so I told him, I said, that's it, I'm not going to be Catholic no more. I said, the Catholic, what they're doing, I think it was in New Orleans and some of the places that were heavily Catholic, and so I was going through that state of rejecting the Christianity. And I was definitely not in any mood at that time to become part of another religion, which was Islam. So when I followed Brother Malcolm, I followed him from a total secular position. And wherever he spoke in the New York area, after I heard that church, I would go and listen to it. If he mentioned a book, I'd try to read the book. If he mentioned a magazine article, I'd try to find that article. And I just listened to him. And then in January, in late December 1963, when he was suspended and left the Nation of Islam. A friend of mine, I was working at Time Inc. then, as what they call an editorial reference clerk, and she was working as an internship with NBC when they were just beginning to take black folks on in interns at NBC, and we were both working in Rockefeller Center in New York. And we used to meet down there every day and have lunch or breakfast together. And one day she said to me, would you like to be part of a new black nationalist organization? And it kind of shocked me because, I always tease her. I said, later, I said, I always looked upon you as looking like Miss AKA. It never came to me that you would be talking about being a part of a black nationalist organization, And so she told me, she said, I'll call you on Saturday morning, tell you where to meet, what time, what place, and don't ask no questions. So I didn't ask any questions when I got this call Saturday morning, told me to meet at this place in Harlem. And that kind of shocked me because this place had a reputation of being one of those places that you could check in for 2 hours. It was a motel, one of those places you could check in for 2 hours, which means that it was, kind of a hot spot. So I was surprised that we were going to be meeting there. And I went up, that's on Saturday morning, on the ground level conference room. I walked into the room. I saw Dr. John Henry Clark, who I did not know, had met, but had heard about, but did not know. John Oliver Killens, the author, he was there, and about 9 or 10 other people, some of whom I had seen but did not know. And I really did not know I was going to be involved with Brother Malcolm till after I'd been there maybe about 20 minutes, and he walked through the door. When he walked through the door, I almost fell off my chair to realize I was getting ready to be a part of something with Brother Malcolm. And that's how we began the OAAU. And when we trying to do different things, people were going to be volunteering for the education committee, the youth committee, the political committee, the economic committee, the different committees, and nobody volunteered to do the newsletter. And though I had absolutely no journalism at the time, I volunteered to do the newsletter. And that's how I became editor of our newsletter. We eventually did 9 issues. The first 2 issues were just the OAAU newsletter. I think beginning with the 4th issue, there would be beginning to be talk, in New York at least, about a white backlash against what was happening in the movement. So we decided to call our newsletter the Blacklash. And that became the name of the newsletter, the OAAU, Organization of Afro-American Unity, Blacklash. Now the name itself showed Brother Malcolm's Pan-Africanism, because it was based on the name of the Organization of African Unity, which had been founded in 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. By the summer of 1964, and Brother Malcolm told us at the time that his biggest agenda was, he had an international agenda. We had our domestic agenda and an international agenda. And there was no other organization I knew at that time that had a real serious international agenda. And I don't think there had been one that I was aware of since Marcus Garvey and his strong internationalist approach back in the early 1900s. Brother Malcolm made it very clear to us that as far as he was concerned, the fate of African people on the continent and African people in the diaspora, especially those of us in North America, was totally connected, totally. And that neither one of us is going to go anywhere without the other. And for either the Africans to believe that they are going to, or it's just a bunch of jive. We might make a little bit here and there, but that we were the ones who were going to be, we could either get together and improve the condition of black people around the world, because if he felt as if those two groups got together, that we would really be able to accomplish a lot. And the other people in South America and the Caribbean, places like that, would then follow. But that the key was the Africans on the continent and people of African descent in North America get together and work with each other. That was his position. One of the things that he really, really, really pushed was that we all become Pan-Africanists. That's what he told us. You must be a Pan-Africanist. You must believe that there's some kind of connection between black people all over the world. And he also believed that a strong Africa would be a protection for black people all over the world. Now, on February the 20th, 1965, the day before he was assassinated, by this time, I'm thinking I'm like big time, editor. So I had, if you can believe this, I am bugging Brother Malcolm about writing something specifically for the newsletter. Now we had run, statements and news releases and papers that he issued. We had printed all those in our newsletter. But I wanted something specifically, I want Brother Malcolm, I want you to write something for the newsletter. If you can imagine me bugging Brother Malcolm, but that's what I was doing. All of a sudden I had become this big time editor. And so on February 20th, he gave me an article. It never was published because of the assassination the next day. But in that article, again, pushing his Pan-Africanist concept, it wasn't just romantic. See, a lot of folks, when they talk about connecting with Africa, it's kind of romantic. And then when something happens, then they become almost anti-African. When they say if they go to Africa and they're not given a warm welcome by everybody, then they become very hostile. Brother Malcolm's position about Africa had a very solid practical foundation, as well as the cultural and emotional foundation. He said that when I was a child growing up in Lansing, Michigan, by the way, I'm sure you're aware that his family, his mother and father were Garveyites. He said that you would hear people say, you don't have a Chinaman's chance. You don't have a Chinaman's chance. That meant no matter what you were trying to do, there was absolutely no possible way you were going to be able to do it. He said, but now that China has become a force on the world scene, you don't hear nobody saying that anymore. A strong China has become a protection for people of Chinese descent, no matter where they are in the world. That's, he said, is what a continental Africa can be for black folks. That's the reason behind his Pan-Africanism. So it wasn't just, the emotional, cultural connection. It had a sound, practical basis for his beliefs. And that's why he made that sincere effort to reach out. In May of 1964, Brother Malcolm went to Africa. And on that trip, he had audiences. And folks, it wasn't like, you meet somebody at a reception and you shake your hand and say hello, and they shake your hand, you talk for a bit, and then they move on. He had audiences ranging from 1.5 hours to 3 hours with African presidents, such as President Nasser of Egypt, President Nkrumah of Ghana, President Ezekwe of Nigeria, President Kenyatta of Kenya, President Nyerere of Tanzania, President Toure of Guinea, and Prime Minister Obote of Uganda. In other words, they were treating him almost as though he was the Secretary of State for black folks. They gave him audiences. When he went, as a result of that, at the OAU, the second OAU meeting in Cairo in 1964, he was invited as an observer, not a participant, but as an observer. And he went and presented a long paper, which I include in my memoir, outlining his position to the African heads of state as to why it was absolutely critical of them, for them to have unity on the continent, and for them to be aware of what was happening with us in this country. He wrote this long paper. As a result of that, something happened that was not almost, why am I saying almost? That was unheard of. The OAU issued a proclamation condemning discrimination in the United States as a direct result of the groundwork laid by Brother Malcolm. Now I can imagine what J. Edgar Hoover and the CIA thought when that happened. They issued, now I'm not going to say it was the most militant proclamation in the world, but just anything, I have a copy of it here, anything of that type. When this country was going around the world saying that we are the protectors of liberty, you have to remember now, this is the height of the so-called Cold War. And of course, the Russians were using the race situation against the United States on an international level. And Brother Malcolm, of course, was well aware of this. I tell y'all folks, I truly believe that if there had not been a Cold War, the federal government would have allowed the civil rights movement to be crushed. Just as the federal government did nothing when people were being lynched in the 1920s. I mean, they were lynching black folks right and left. Federal government, oh, we can't do anything. That's a state thing. And they would have done the same thing with the civil rights movement if they had not been involved in the Cold War, where they had to do something because of what was going on. President Eisenhower, 1957 with Little Rock. When those kids went to Little Rock Central High School, they kept saying, President Eisenhower, look what they're doing to those, oh, it's a state thing, we can't do anything. Then one day that someone brought him a copy of the Russian newspaper Pravda, and the whole front page was devoted to Little Rock. The next day he nationalized the Arkansas National Guard to protect those kids. Now before he couldn't do anything. John F. Kennedy did the same thing in Birmingham. He nationalized the Alabama National Guard after word got out that the black folks in Birmingham were getting ready to start organizing and fight back and protect each other. They were going to do self-defense, which is what Brother Malcolm advocated. He didn't advocate violence, he advocated self-defense. So that's when Kennedy nationalized the Alabama National Guard. So as you can see, the so-called Cold War, and this is not to put down the heroism of the brothers and sisters who participated in the movement. It took, even with that, people put their lives on the line. They were being brutalized and firebombed and killed during the days of the movement. But it would have been much, much worse, I think, if the federal government was not forced to move because of the international situation. Brother Malcolm understood this. That's why he knew, and he figured, so what he said, told us that we're going to have the United States government taken before the UN Commission on Human Rights and being accused of being either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of black people. Now, from what I understand from Dr. John Henry Clark later, he had gotten 6 African countries to agree. By the way, you have to understand, an individual could not go before the UN like that. He had to be a member of the UN. And by the way, the United States government to this very day, as we sit here, has never signed the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Because from what I understand, if it signed that, then individual black people could go to the UN as individuals. But because they haven't signed it, it's one of the few countries in the world that has never signed the UN Commission on Human Rights. Never signed it to this very day. And so, with them having not done this, Brother Malcolm was going to get African countries to agree. He had gotten, Dr. Clark, 6 had agreed to do so. There were several others who were considering it. Also, because that reclamation came because of what he had done. A second thing, in December 1964, there was a tremendous debate at the UN on the situation in the Congo. The United States, England, and Belgium had invaded the Congo, quote unquote, to save some white nuns from these African savages. This is what they said, why they invaded the Congo. And at the UN debate, for the first time in history, 2 African diplomats during the debate around U.S. Congo. By the way, folks, the reason they wanted the Congo was because of copper. I'll talk to you a little bit more about the wealth of the continent, very briefly about that. Congo was one of the world's greatest resources of copper, which is a major need of the industrial world. That's why they wanted to keep control of the Congo. It had nothing to do with, but they said, we got to go in and save these nuns, because these Africans are going to kill these white nuns. At the UN debate around that issue, the UN ambassador from Ghana and the UN ambassador from Guinea, and I'm paraphrasing, although I have the direct quotes here, they said basically, if the United States has the right, claims the right, to invade the Congo to save those nuns, who's to say that we don't have the right to assist black folks who are being killed and murdered by white supremacists in Mississippi? They said this at the UN in the debates. Again, unheard of. they did this, why? Because of the groundwork laid by Brother Malcolm. And as a result of that, the New York newspaper had an article called Angry Racist Africans. They called the Africans racist Africans in one of the New York City newspapers. And it also said that Adlai Stevenson, who was the U.S. UN ambassador, and other Western diplomats were astounded that these African diplomats made that connection. They made that connection because of the groundwork laid by Brother Malcolm. Can you imagine Hoover and the CIA, what they were thinking? What is this man doing? He's pulling the shade off of all these lies we've been telling about how we're the land of liberty and freedom and justice for all and equal opportunity, equal justice. He's got people responding to that, hey, we ain't that. Later, in the 1990s, I read a book called Official and Confidential, The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover, written by a British writer named Anthony Summers. And in this book, which is a big, thick book, maybe about 400 some pages, there's absolutely one mention of Brother Malcolm. But it's extremely important if you're going to know what happened on February 21st, 1965. In that book, Summers says, J. Edgar Hoover had a luncheon meeting with then Senator Lyndon Johnson. Now, if it was then Senator Lyndon Johnson, this means that it must have been before 1960, because in 1960, Johnson became vice president. And at that luncheon, he quotes Hoover as saying, quote, "We wouldn't have any problem if we could get those two guys fighting, and we could get them to kill one another off," end of quote. Those two guys were Brother Malcolm and Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, that's a statement made by J. Edgar Hoover. Since it was then senator, so it had to be sometime, I'm assuming it was the late 1950s. That early, he was already seeing and being concerned about these two brothers. And of course, we know what ended up with both of them. But that's what he said. And I have never seen any denial that Hoover made that statement. Later on, when they put COINTELPRO together, they said we must prevent the rise of a black messiah, the FBI. Probably Malcolm X would have been one had he not been killed. Then they listed future possibilities of being that. And they said Elijah Muhammad, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael. Then they said, well, forget about Elijah Muhammad, he's too old. So they listed Dr. King and Stokely when they put out COINTELPRO, which was counterintelligence. They put out to spy on the black community. What ended up? Dr. King ended up assassinated, and Stokely was basically exiled. I mean, this is serious stuff, folks. See, you're not taught this. You're given the impression that this little Malcolm X was killed by these black Muslims, and Dr. King was killed by this low-income, working-class white man. No. I have no doubt that the people who literally pulled the triggers and shot Brother Malcolm that Sunday afternoon were members of the Nation of Islam. I don't deny that. But they did it with a wink and a nod from the FBI. And I would believe to this day they were told that if you do it, don't worry, nobody will be arrested. And they weren't. The only reason, and I will believe this till the day I die, that there was a trial was that one of the brothers in our security group had brought his pistol with him to the rally. And he was able to shoot the guy named Hare in the leg, which slowed him down, and he was caught by the crowd outside the Audubon Ballroom, and they probably would have would have killed him had the cops snatched him and took him away. Threw him in a police car and took him away. Then they had to, once he got caught, they had to do something real quick. So they rushed out and picked up these other two Muslim dudes the next day and accused them of being a part of the assassination. And then they stopped. That was it. Now, everybody who was there said there were at least 5 people actually involved. 2 people who started a ruckus, and then 3 people who did the shooting. That was nothing else was said. The other 4 assassins were never touched by the government. One of them just died. The one who actually pulled the shotgun that left all the bullet holes in Brother Malcolm's body, he just died about 3 or 4 months ago up in Newark. He just died. In his book, Conspiracies Unraveled, this is the definitive book on the assassination of Brother Malcolm by Professor Zach Kondo. And he named the 5 guys way back in, I think in 1993 when that book came out. He named the 5 guys. And to this day, none of them were touched. And the last one died. So that also tells me something else. They know who did it. They knew, it was no secret. They knew. Zach revealed who they were to the rest of us when he wrote this book. And he named them. So once again, they got away with basically with murder. And this was done because of what Brother Malcolm was doing internationally. You're a black man, you in America, as long as you stay within the United States, you can say just about anything. You can say all kind of stuff, and they may watch you. But when you start going international, getting involved in things that are going on internationally, that's when they regard you as dangerous. Dr. King became the dominant force in the Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam War. And besides that, I reread recently Dr. King's speech that he made at the Nobel, when he got the Nobel Peace Prize. And in that speech, he talked about connecting the civil rights movement with the liberation movement that was going on in Africa at the time, 1964. You can bet your life that Hoover and his boys and the CIA said, hey, wait a minute. Brother, that's why February 21st, 1965 happened, and that's why April 4th, 1968 happened. Because these 2 brothers had not only influence nationally, they were listened to internationally. And they were both questioning what they were doing, this whole thing that the United States had put out about how holy it was. They were saying, It ain't happening like that. There's some things going on at that time. Just think about all the people who were being killed between 1955 and 1965. Who were literally killed. I mean, we're not even talking about the ones who were brutalized and fired. It was terrorism, y'all. Terrorism. They never use the term when they teach it in American history. The lynchings, that was terrorism. That was terrorism. Call it what it is. It was terrorism. Terrorism is nothing new in the United States. It's nothing new. It is projected that the so-called terrorism of the last 10 years or so that's a brand new thing. No, it's not. Terrorism has been a part of this country's history. It was terrorism that destroyed the indigenous people in North America. That was terrorism. It was terrorism that Nat Turner was trying to combat, and Gabriel Prosser, and Denmark Vesey, and all those African warriors. And by the way, We should not really, they were not African American. They were Africans. We didn't get citizenship in this country until after the Civil War, right? Right, Earl? So you can't call, when we talk ourselves, we should not refer to Nat Turner as an African American because he wasn't. He was an African. Those people who were fighting during that time, they were Africans. We became African American after the Civil War. We got to be right in the way we teach history too. I'll talk about that day and then I'll answer questions. February 21st, 1965 was a really, really cold, sunny day, but very cold. I lived in, right as I said, I was living in Central Harlem. Not in my same great apartment. I had lost it by then. But I went up to the Audubon Ballroom, which was a nice subway ride away. And now the Audubon Ballroom, y'all, was a huge space, almost the length of a football field, and very wide. They had parties, and it was rented out to have big-time parties and dances and that kind of thing. Right across the street from Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. By the way, Columbia University at that time was saying that it was in Morningside Heights. You tell Columbia University that you were in Harlem, they'd be ready to shoot you. And I just tell them, I said, wait a minute now, if there's a Central Harlem and an East Harlem, there gotta be a West Harlem. And Columbia is in West Harlem. Because they'll say that now. But in those days you could say, but I got to the Audubon Ballroom and I was there when Brother Malcolm came in. When he came in that Sunday, he said to me, Brother Peter, when you get a chance, come backstage, I want to talk to you. So I said, okay. 5 or 6 minutes later, I went backstage. Now remember now, this brother had, 2 weeks before that, he had been banned from France. The week before that, his home had been firebombed. And for the first time, his children and his wife were put in direct danger because they were in the house when it was firebombed. So he's under a lot of pressure, besides the regular pressure that he was been under all along. So I went backstage, like he had asked me to come back there, and he said, Brother Peter, I know you, what had happened, I had written a news release type thing to be distributed the next day at the rally, saying that despite the being banned from France and the firebombing of his home, you know, that we were still behind him, you know, that kind of thing. But I must have said something else to this day. I don't know what it was, because we had already run them off, and there was a stack of them, you know, and so I just put them all to the side. I never know what happened to them, never saw them again. But he asked me to not distribute it. So he said, I know you put a lot of work in that, and I hope you understood why I asked you to not distribute it. And I said yes. And I said yes because in the very first issue of the newsletter, Brother Malcolm had saved my behind. Because I wrote my first journalistic article was about the killing of that 15-year-old boy by that policeman in Harlem that led to the Harlem Uprising in 1964. And so I said to Brother Malcolm was in Africa at the time. Now, some of the New York City newspapers saying he was over some secret hideaway in Queens directing the uprising, but he's in Africa. And by the way, Brother Malcolm did not believe in spontaneous act, because he felt that sometimes the cops would deliberately provoke certain things to smoke certain people out so they could make mass arrests. So he was basically telling us, keep our people out of that. Keep our people out of that whole thing that was going on in the streets of Harlem. But I had been the first one over, did my first journalistic article. I got a call about I went over to interview the kids, and I wrote an article about it for the first issue of the newsletter. And one of the things I said when Brother Malcolm was calling back from Cairo to the office to get updated to what was going on from different people who had different responsibilities, when it was my turn to speak with him, I would read him what I had written. When I got to the line, I said, eyewitnesses to the murder. And Brother Malcolm said, no, Brother Peter, you can't say murder, because murder and murderer are legal terms that you can only use when he's been convicted. And you know he's going to be acquitted. And then he can sue for defamation. He said, call him a killer, and refer to it as a killing, because he's a killer, and it's a killing no matter what the circumstances. So the brother who was kind of in charge of the production side of the newsletter, we sat down and we were not going to go back and rerun 500 or 600 more of those things on that old memory, with the turn the mimeograph machine. So we sat down and scratched out the word murder and wrote killing at the top. And I still have copies of that newsletter this day with killing written at the top. Well, sure enough, when Gilligan was acquitted, he sued both SCLC, Martin Luther King's organization, and CORE for distributing materials calling him a murderer. So when Brother Malcolm said that to me that Sunday, after that, I said, I understand why you said that, So he said, okay, and we talked about, I showed him an article from the New York Times that Sunday about the Deacons for Defense and Justice, which had been formed down in Louisiana to protect people who were demonstrating. And I still think that's the greatest name ever came out of the Civil Rights Movement, the Deacons for Defense and Justice. That's what they were called. I love that name. And I showed it to him, he read it, he said, that's what I'm talking about, self-defense, self-defense. And then we talked about other things with the other 3 or 4 people who were back there. And I tell y'all, that was the first time in all the time I had been around Brother Malcolm, I had seen him looking a little bit weary, not scared or frightened or that, but just down. And I tell people, I think it was because with the firebombing of his home, for the first time, his children, his 4 daughters, and his wife were put in direct danger. That's a whole new ball game. Because you can say, your life is in danger, but when somebody, you have to say, do I have the right to put my children and my wife in this kind of danger? Now I will always believe that's why he was looking a little bit down that Sunday. Not depressed or anything like that, but a little bit down. And I remember him saying, the way I feel today, I shouldn't even be here. So we said to him, well, Brother Malcolm, why don't you go home? Everybody know you've been under a lot of pressure. Things have happened. Why don't you go home? And he said, well, I got to talk to the people today because I got to tell them about being banned from France and about the firebombing of his home. They want to hear it from me. So I got to be here to do that. And then he said, after I've been backstage maybe about 15, 20 minutes, he asked, did either one of us recognize a minister, a Baptist minister, who was going to come to our rally that day and ask for clothing for his children, because all of that clothing had been burned up in the firebombing. And so I said, okay, I know who he looks like. He said, well, go out front, and when he comes in, bring him backstage. So I went out front. I brought him. I was waiting for him in the little lobby area, and I heard Brother Malcolm say, Assalamu alaikum, and the next thing I heard was shots. Now, to me, at that time, it sounded like 1,000 shots. I swear it did. It sounded like 1,000 shots. I was in the Autobahn, you had to go through these swinging doors, and I was in this lobby area. So those of us who were in the lobby area, we ran into the bathroom, because we didn't know what was going on. We just heard all this shooting and screaming and everything. So when the shooting stopped, I jumped down, I went through the swinging doors, and I ran down to the stage, and I jumped up on the stage. And when I got there, Mary Koshiyama, who was a Japanese American whose family had been put in concentration camps during World War II. She was not a member of our organization, but she was a strong supporter. She was the only non-black person who was very close to our organization. And she had Brother Malcolm cradled in her arms, and the jacket was open, and I saw all of these bullet holes in his chest. And I remember thinking to myself, he's going to die, he's going to die. He was gasping at the time. And these brothers came back, as Earl said, Columbia Presbyterian Hospital right across the street. Not a doctor came back with them. They had to literally bogart or roll a stretcher. They rolled back, put him on the stretcher, and rolled him over to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. I don't know, I think he was dead before that even happened. And I'm not going to say any doctor could have saved his life, but it was seen to me that in a situation like that, at least one doctor from that hospital could have come to the Audubon Ballroom right across the street. I've despised that hospital ever since then. Even to this day, I despise Columbia Presbyterian Hospital because of that. I jumped off the stage after they rolled him out, and I saw two cops in the Audubon. I mean, people were laying around on the floors and chairs knocked over and all that kind of stuff. And I was going to say something to them, and my roommate, I don't know where he popped up from, he grabbed me and said, "Keep your mouth shut," and took me out of the Audubon ballroom and home. And when I got home, I just kind of sat down. And I wrote later that day and the next day my reactions about, my immediate reactions about the assassination. And they were included in my memoir. What I wrote that day, I didn't change nothing. I printed it exactly the way I wrote it that day. Later, I was really surprised when Brother Malcolm's widow, Sister Betty Shabazz, asked me to be a pallbearer, because I didn't really know her hardly at all. I had met her a couple of times. Sometime when Brother Malcolm came back from his trips, there were a couple of times he would ask me to ride in the car with him and his wife, back to their home. And I did so. And she told me later that she asked me because he liked the job I was doing with the newsletter. And at that time, I looked like real Joe College. He called me that college boy. That she said, but she told me, and of course this has always meant very much to me, that he spoke to her about how pleased he was with what I was doing with the newsletter. And that's why she asked me to be a pallbearer at the funeral. And I was. And I'll stop there. But Brother Malcolm, folks, was killed. And right away, I never say he was killed or he died. I always, being a journalist, got to be aware of words. He was assassinated. He didn't die. Martin Luther King didn't die on April the 4th. He was assassinated. That puts it immediately into a historical context. Or, not, he died. What did he die from? Cancer? Liver cancer? Oh, he was killed. How was he killed? Was he run over by a car? No, he was assassinated. Right away, that makes it political. And the United States government, in the realm of the Federal Bureau of Investigation under J. Edgar Hoover, and the CIA, and those organizations were, as far as I am concerned, were concretely involved in those assassinations. And what I'm planning on doing now, as Brother Earl said, is I'm going to working on a book. I'm going to begin working on a book on the 1st of March that's going to focus solely on what he was doing internationally. And I have, some stuff here that explains that. Thank you very much.
We've got time for a few questions. Anybody in the audience want to ask Peter any specific questions at this time?
Yes, sir. You mentioned before about what Malcolm said on attacks of the mind.
Yes.
I wanted to get your opinion on what seems to be the currently repopularized form of blackface in America. And you have many cases of like white people in college and outside of school just wearing blackface, or they did blackface here or there, and it seems to be a lot of portrayal in that in media. And would you call that an attack on the mind currently, or how would you break that down?
Well, that's a part of the historical attacks. See, other than the people who killed people, who lynched people, the most destructive force against black folks in the United States and on the continent of Africa has been Hollywood movies. Hollywood movies have been a devastating force, and they were all attacks on the mind. You see those old movies, as I was telling about the movies I saw as a child. So this whole, it continues. I got a 17-year-old grandson. I asked him about 4 or 5 months ago. He goes to public high school right here in Virginia, right outside of Richmond. I said, have you ever been taught that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were enslavers of African people? And he said, no. Only reason I know that, Grandpa, is you tell me. They do not teach you all today. Those two men were slave owners. Nobody teaches that. And I recently wrote an article in the New York Daily News, which is a big newspaper in New York City, in which I said that we better understand something. I said, let me put this up front. The American public school system will never, never, in the foreseeable future, teach the real deal about our history. We're going to have to do it. It will never happen, never. Anytime we spend trying to get the public schools to teach black history, as far as I'm concerned, is a waste of time. Black churches, black sororities, fraternities, professional groups are going to have to make it a part of their agendas to teach black history. And history is very important. Lerone Bennett Jr., who is one of my mentors and my heroes, he wrote an article that I would advise every one of you to read if you get a chance, called "Why Black History is Important to You." And in that memoir, he says the past is a bet that your fathers placed that you must now cover. When I read it, I always say the past is a bet. I change it a little bit. I said that your ancestors placed. But that article, "Why Black History is Important to You," by Lerone Bennett Jr., in February 1982, Ebony magazine, should be read by every black child in America. And yes, the attacks on the mind continue to this very day. Gangster rap was an attack, a psychological attack on the minds of young black people. As far as I'm concerned, Snoop Dogg and Ice-T and Ice this and all those folks, they are nothing but modern day minstrels. They are modern day with those same, like what they have back in the early 1900s, Mantan Moreland, Step and Fetch It, those kind of names. So what do you have today? Snoop Dogg, it's the same thing. They are modern day minstrels and they are living on blood money, as far as I'm concerned. Jay-Z, all of them. They're living on blood money. And they have done they are responsible for a lot of young dudes being dead or in jail with all that stuff they were advocating. I worked with Dr. C. Dolores Tucker as editor of her publication, and I was very involved with that. All that stuff. They're not attacking white folks, by the way. Suge Knight told Dr. Tucker that one time somebody was doing some song. Now this is Suge Knight, and they were talking about what they're going to do to the black bees and the black bees, you know which way I'm talking about, the black bees. And then they said something about in the song, when I get that, I'm going to deal with the Jew bees. And you know what they told him? Oh, no. Ain't going to be no Jew bees in that song. And they took it out. They took it out. When Michael Jackson used the word kike in a song, it was a derogatory word for the Jewish community, like nigger is with us. Steven Spielberg said that he will never forgive Michael Jackson for forcing him to explain to his child the meaning of that word. But those dudes were using the N-word all throughout their music. Wasn't that gangster rap? And you notice now, and I don't want nobody to go running out of here misquoting me. I said gangster rap. Rap music is out of the black culture. Gil Scott-Heron was a rapper. Black preachers have rapped for centuries. Black preachers have been rapping since time immemorial. So rapping is right out of our culture. Gangster rap was something that was put in there by somebody else and made a whole lot of money for a few folks. And as far as I'm concerned, and now they're all very respectable. Those same ones who talking all this stuff, now they're on television and they're doing this, they're doing that. Well, a lot of those young brothers and sisters, especially young brothers, who listen to them are either dead or in jail. They are no good skunks, those gangster rappers.
First, I want to thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. But I just caught a question after listening to what you just said, and I wanted to just get some clarification. When you speak about like gangster rap being, as you would call it, like a big downfall of our people and what they're expressing, all I can look at is right now, just as you said, we weren't taught about our history from the black perspective, about what we actually did and everything that was going on that wasn't shown to us and taught in the school systems. So when we have, even though their message wasn't so desired by, I guess you could say, your generation, that is the biggest success that a lot of the people saw without having to be told in the school systems that this is what was going on. You see rappers being successful even now.
Brother, I said gangster rap, don't say gangster. I have nothing problem with rappers, none. None.
So,
Rappers are direct, they came out of the black cultural tradition. So I have no problem with rappers.
okay, so my apologies, let me specify gangster rap. With that being said, on the same point, gangster rap put some of the most influential people now that we have in the positions that they are, and now their message isn't the same message that they were speaking when they were trying to.
Too late. Tell that to all those young dudes who followed that stuff they were saying who are now dead or in jail.
Right.
You know, tell them that now everything is cool because now all of a sudden you become nice and respectable.
Yeah,
You made your money. I mean, black people who are willing to put down black people have always been able to make money in this country. Always. That is nothing new. Since time immemorial, black people who are willing to go along with the system and write and to do and act things that were demeaning to the black community, all those people who did all those Hollywood movies, some of the great people, Ozzie Davis and those type of people, they wouldn't do those kind of movies. They could have said, well, you know, I'm going to do those movies, man, like Massa, and yeah, and Gwine, I'm going, you know. They could have said, because you can make money. It is always a black person who's willing to play the role of the fool, of the thing, and by the way, from what I understand, the biggest purchaser of that music were white boys. So no. And just, there's some things you know just by being a human being. Don't nobody have to teach you that certain things are wrong. You know that just by being a human being. And those cats were glorifying actions and activities that they know were wrong. They did it purely to make money. They did not do it because they were poor. In fact, some of them came out of middle-class backgrounds and were playing gangster. I saw Tupac Shakur in a play when he was about 12 years old in New York. He played the boy in Raisin in the Sun. Raisin in the Sun. He knew exactly. Tupac Shakur was no struck to dudes off the streets. That was where you make money. Some of these guys were here faking they off the streets and they came out of middle-class homes. You know, it's a way to make money. I could have made much more money if I'd been able to some stuff I would have been willing to write or do. You know? So no, I'm not on that issue, man. I am like, I give no slack. Those guys were psychologically destructive to our people, and especially to our young people, and did tremendous amount of damage, psychological damage. And even and despite the money they made, they were really still getting the crumbs. The big money was still being made by the white boys.
Next question.
We just have one last question on this side, please.
How you doing today, sir? My name is Randall Williams. I'm a junior journalism major from Chicago. My question is, the protest that has caught eyes in the most recent years has been the protest of Colin Kaepernick, and he's done work both domestically and internationally. So what do you think of his protest and the stance and sacrifice that he's
I think the brother is truly a person who's been willing to stand for what he believes, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for him. But again, this is one of the few areas in America, if the black NFL players had gotten behind this brother, he would not have been banned. They didn't. They didn't. This is one of the few areas where the black presence is so strong and so overwhelming that they can affect. They can say, y'all do this or we ain't playing. what they gonna do? Go out there and get these dudes who are not good players and put them in? They tried that, and it didn't work. Those black athletes in the NFL and the NBA are in a position to do tremendous things. I feel as though that dude, I give him all the credit in the world for what he did, and I'm just really annoyed that more of the NFL players did not fully back him, because if they had, the situation would now be different. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank you guys all again for coming out, and can you please give a round of applause for our guest, Peter Bailey. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Well, the Caldwell Cafe class would like to honor Mr. Peter Bailey with a gift and happy belated birthday. Thank you guys so much. Good luck on your midterms, and do not forget to sign in if you have a class, okay?
By the way, I would say that my 27th birthday was my worst birthday because it happened 3 days after the assassination of Brother Malcolm. And his burial was tomorrow, the 27th, February 27th was the burial date. So that period, is not a very pleasant period.